Hello, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for tuning in to Al Monitor's latest webinar in our series on the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza and its regional fallout. My name is Elizabeth Hagedorn. I cover the State Department for Al Monitor, and I'm so pleased to be joined by my colleague, Jared Szuba, who is Al Monitor's Pentagon correspondent. Jared is here to talk about the expected U.S. military response to a drone attack blamed on Iran-backed militias in Iraq last weekend that killed 3 American service members in Jordan. Over the next 30 or so minutes, we'll discuss the military options on the table as the Biden administration crafts its response. Plus, what does this mean for the future of U.S. troops stationed in Iraq and Syria? And is the U.S. succeeding at deterring the Houthis in Yemen? I'll start with a few questions of my own before kicking it over to questions from our live audience. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Jared, thanks so much for being here and for taking our questions.
Sure, thanks for having me.
I think I'd like to start with the question that everyone has right now following Sunday's attack in Jordan, and that is, what can we expect in terms of a U.S. response, and what are you hearing about possible targets?
Yeah, that's the $10 million question. I mean, there have been no shortage of articles this week, in the press, speculating on what the targets may be. I think a more interesting and helpful question is really, what does the Biden administration want to achieve? They really don't have, too much of a shortage of targets. There are sensitive IRGC sites in Syria, sites that are used by the militias. They could always hit more warehouses in Iraq and Syria, storage facilities, command centers. There are militia leaders in Iraq and Syria, which they could target. Some of that has been done in recent weeks with mixed, if not, unclear results in terms of establishing deterrence. But it's important, I think, to keep in mind that there is something of an a direct relationship between risk of escalation with the targets the Biden administration chooses and the chance at deterrence, reestablishing deterrence. Given the lay of the land and sort of the position of U.S. troops, which have come under more than 160, maybe 170 now attacks in recent months, and given the talking points that are coming out of the Biden administration, I think it's clear that they're not looking for an escalation. They're looking to make this as surgical as possible to send a signal without starting a major shooting match. And you've seen the talking points sort of narrow over the past couple of days. From we will hold everyone responsible who has any sort of fingerprints on this Tower 22 drone attack, which killed 3 U.S. soldiers, to more Secretary Austin yesterday saying, implying that there's going to be more of a focus on attriting the militia's materiel, Iranian drone supplies, Shahids, these sorts of things. So it's a good question. I think we're all waiting to see.
There we go. It strikes me it's been 5 days since that attack in Jordan. The U.S. has now formally blamed the umbrella group called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. So why the delay in striking back?
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, there's a couple of ways you could read that. One of them could be that the president has instructed, and I'm not saying he has, this is just sort of reading the tea leaves here, potentially has instructed his generals, look, previous strikes haven't worked. To deter these attacks, we need to make a really big impression on these militias and on the IRGC that we are serious, reassert U.S. dominance in Iraq and Syria against these factions. But you don't want to get into prolonged shooting match, so don't screw this up. That is to say, wait until the intelligence is rock solid, until movable targets, whether they be military hardware or potentially militia or IRGC personnel, wait until they are dead to rights in terms of in the crosshairs with U.S. intelligence and surveillance, and then move. Because if you screw this up, I mean, the stakes are fairly high here. You've got 2,500 U.S. troops, according to official numbers, in Iraq. You've got roughly 900, just under 1,000, again, official numbers, in Syria. And you have ongoing dialogue with Baghdad right now about the potential future of the coalition presence in Iraq. Now, Baghdad, certainly the Iraqi government of Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Sudani, is not going to be pleased if US AC-130s just start blitzing up militia locations all over the country. So that's going to put pressure politically on Sudani to push for a withdrawal of US forces from Iraq. If that were to happen, a lot of hypotheticals baked in here, and if the US were to comply with that over the coming year or two, that would make it much harder for the United States to sustain its mission in Syria, which is a very important mission in the sense that it's containing tens of thousands of ISIS prisoners and their families left over from the campaign. So this is a really sensitive moment, and not just for those reasons, but yeah.
Yeah, I want to get into more about the future of U.S. troops in both Iraq and Syria in a bit. But first, I mean, the million-dollar question is, as you say, is of course how the U.S. will respond. But I'm curious, what is your assessment of how Iran and its militias are likely to respond to whatever retaliatory action the U.S. does take?
Yeah, that's certainly a question that the White House has weighed very seriously. And not just now, but going way back in terms of planning for this sort of contingency in past years. That's going to, I mean, the likely response by Iran and the militia is going to, of course, not to evade the question here, but it's going to depend on the U.S. response. And I think Biden really has two major options on a spectrum. He can strike so hard and so intensely, up to including, targets inside Iranian territory, that he can attempt to change Iran's strategic calculus. The U.S. officials say that Iran, these militias are conducting these attacks because Iran's strategic calculus is they want to create enough pressure on the United States that the U.S. withdraws troops from the region, particularly from Iraq and Syria. I don't think the Biden administration is going to do something to that would be that escalatory. And I don't think it would actually succeed in changing Iran's strategic calculus. I mean, when former President Trump had Qasem Soleimani killed, it didn't change Iran's strategic calculus. It may have, some may argue it may have quieted the drones and rockets for a few months, but you still see these militia attacks. That was 4 years ago. So that's the one extreme end of the spectrum. I think that's very unlikely. The other end of the spectrum that the U.S. could take, the approach they could take, is simply just knocking out more warehouses, waiting till the middle of the night when few personnel are around, avoiding casualties to the extent that's possible, sort of minimal splashback result. I think the Biden administration is closer to that approach. Now, remember, U.S. officials have now repeatedly said that this is going to be a tiered approach, this is a phased approach. So it's not just a one and done, a big attack, splash, deter the militias, show them who's boss. That's not how the Biden administration is approaching this. It's more likely that they're going to start with something more sensitive than simple warehouses, but these strikes are going to create something of an impression, but they're probably going to be designed very specifically not to create, an immediate or a serious militia response. And you're already starting to see the militias and Iran, for example, Iran as well, going into something of damage control mode after the strike on Tower 22. So again, that's another $10 million question, is how they're going to respond. But I have no doubt that the administration is taking that very carefully into their planning about how these strikes are going to proceed.
In the months leading up to October 7th, Iran and the U.S. were observing a sort of informal truce, right? You had prisoners released on both sides, a sort of slowdown in Iran's nuclear activities, and a slowdown or near halt in proxy attacks. I'm wondering, how do you see this recent escalation in the context of that, in the context of Biden's Iran policy and that of the wider region?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a major setback for the Biden administration. We saw Jake Sullivan's article, National Security Advisor's article in Foreign Affairs, which had to be amended in the online version after the October 7th war broke out. Look, over the past several years, Iran has, through building up factions of non-state actors in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and Yemen, they've built up a bulwark. And arming them with precision-guided munitions and drones, which are capable of evading U.S.-designed air defense systems, which are the predominant, air defense systems in the region. This allows Iran to put tremendous pressure on the US and its allies in the Middle East at a time when Washington is supposed to be singularly focused on East Asia, on deterring China and a potential invasion of Taiwan. The US Navy is spread thin. So this is a strategic liability for the United States. And the attempt to get Iran to the table over the nuclear issue obviously was sort of an attempt to deal with the biggest problem first, but the Biden administration didn't really have a chance or was unable to deal with the proxy problem, which of course is one of the objections to the original JCPOA is that Iran's building up of this bulwark, of a sort of conventional gray zone bulwark of proxies around U.S. partners and allies in the region that wasn't addressed by the original JCPOA. So I think the Biden administration has tried very hard to buy time with Iran throughout the past couple of years. I don't think it's true that the administration didn't have an Iran strategy, I think, or a regional Middle East strategy, I should say. I think the attempt to bring Saudi Arabia into normalization of ties with Israel, it was a clear attempt at building a bulwark, sort of contain or at least counterbalance Iran. But it was really a case of too little, too late. By the time of the Hamas October 7th terror attacks, the fingers were already on the trigger. You've got, the biggest threat in the region now is a potential war between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel. So it's an extremely precarious situation. You saw Secretary of State Anthony Blinken say that this week, saying, perhaps not hyperbolically, that this is the most dangerous conflagration in the region since 1973. I think the CIA director, Bill Burns, put it in a less, didn't use the 20th century analogy, but he said it's the most tangled and explosive the region has been in decades, in his 4 decades of working on it. So this is a real crisis for the Biden administration, and it could get a lot worse. It really, for now, I don't think it's disingenuous when Pentagon officials say the conflict is, if not contained, it's not the full-blown, all-out regional war that very likely, very plausibly could occur.
I just want to remind our viewers, you can submit your questions via the Q&A box on Zoom. We have a few here, so I'll go to one of them from David. He asks, different Israeli governments have described Iran and its proxies with the image of an octopus in such a way that the tentacles would be the proxies in the different countries in the region, and the head would be Iran itself. Israeli governments have debated which strategy to follow, either cut off the tentacles or cut off the head. For the United States, he asks, what would be the most efficient option? And I'll talk on to that question, Jared. How is the Pentagon sort of assessing the leverage and influence that Tehran has over its proxies? Obviously, there's a range with Hezbollah on one end and the Houthis on the other, but how do you see that?
That's an interesting question. The Biden administration is not going to conduct regime change in Iran. That would entail enormous U.S. military commitment to the Middle East, again, at a time when now 3 administrations in a row, this is the 3rd, have been attempting to sort of pivot, not a popular term, but to focus U.S. military forces and redesign the joint force to compete with a rising China, which, U.S. officials have long seen as the biggest threat to American global hegemony. So the Biden administration is not about to get into a war with Iran. At least they don't intend to. They are certainly not going to attack Tehran. As for dealing with the tentacles, that's a very tricky matter. A few years ago, there were upwards of 130,000 U.S. troops in the region. There are now roughly 30 to 35,000. Pentagon planners worked very hard over the past couple of years under the Biden administration to get the U.S. Navy on particularly aircraft carriers on rotations of training and maintenance cycles after long deployments to the Middle East to deter Iran and its proxies during the late Trump administration after the maximum pressure, which was a result of the maximum pressure policy towards Iran. So the Patriot missile system, missile defense systems as well, where many of them were pulled out of the region, out of the Persian Gulf region, out of Saudi Arabia. Many of them have now gone back because they now have to deter these Iran proxy militia attacks. These things take maintenance. They take work. Their teams need training. They need rest. The U.S. Army, which is responsible for air defense in the U.S. military, that's one of the most difficult and has one of the honestly one of the highest suicide rates of any of the jobs in the U.S. Army is air defense. I mean, these are hard rotations. It's hard on the force. It's hard on the equipment, and quite frankly, there isn't enough to go around.
Want to make sure we get in a question about the Houthis in Yemen, who have been carrying out drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Yesterday, the U.S. hit more targets belonging to the group. Since the strikes began, Jared, do we have any indication that the Houthis are backing down? And has the U.S. managed to significantly reduce their military capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the shape of the Houthis campaign has evolved in over the past couple of months. At the beginning, they started with a hijacking, then they quickly moved to sort of drone attacks, and they switched to anti-ship cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Saw a few historic firsts, not that anyone would like to see, but impacts of ballistic missiles in the maritime domain against commercial shipping. They seem to have, if we can take CENTCOM's reporting on these incidents as the whole picture here, they seem to have shifted their targeting from sort of wanton mass barrages of drones and missiles into crowded sea lanes to more focused single missile, two missiles, a few drones headed towards U.S. naval ships and British ships that they believe are linked, including commercial ships that are linked to either the U.S. or Britain. That shift occurred after the United States and the U.K. launched their first round of airstrikes to erode their arsenal across Yemen, air and naval strikes. On January 11th, there's been another round since with the UK. There've been many U.S. rounds of strikes since. So there seems to have been a bit of a shift in the Houthis' tactics. But it does seem that what they have done is that by attacking commercial shipping, they've drawn the U.S. Navy and its allies into patrolling this strategic choke point in the regional economy and to a lesser degree on the global economy. And now that they're just shooting mainly at U.S. and to some extent UK ships, they seem to have pinned down the U.S. Not pinned down, that's not the right term, because the U.S. is actually knocking most of these things down. But they've drawn the U.S. into this tit for tat shooting match, which shows no sign of ending. I mean, senior military officials say they've eroded their capabilities. They've knocked out a lot of their weaponry, but privately, Pentagon officials will admit they aren't 100% sure how much materiel the Houthis have accumulated in recent years. And as we've written, part of that is an intelligence problem. The U.S. now has the U.S. Navy in particular and the Air Force have a good deal of intelligence and eyes in the sky on the Yemeni coast. But the Biden administration, one of their first foreign policy moves was to sort of end support for the Saudi-led coalition's war in Yemen. That entailed a reduction of U.S. intelligence on the Houthis. So it's not clear, how many ballistic missiles I think they have. I'm sure the Pentagon has an assessment somewhere, but the folks I've spoken to say it's pretty hard to get at.
Keeping on Yemen, this escalation in the Red Sea comes as Saudi Arabia and the Houthis were nearing a peace agreement, or if not a peace agreement, at least an agreement for Saudi Arabia to withdraw from the conflict. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia and most other Arab states didn't join on to the maritime coalition established by the United States in December. Jared, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, the participation that we're seeing from allies and partners in the region. And we have a question here from the audience that I think ties into that. For Gulf countries watching instability in the Red Sea, what kind of weapons or defense treaties are they looking to get from the U.S. to increase their own deterrence? So how are the Houthi attacks perhaps changing the calculus of countries in the Gulf?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer those in reverse order. Look, uh, Saudi Arabia wants a defense pact with the United States, whether that's a formal treaty or some sort of other arrangement. I think the talks are still on for that. You saw a congressional delegation last month go to meet with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Al Ula, and I think it's actually astonishing that in some ways that Saudi Arabia is still interested in doing this sort of trilateral deal between normalizing Israel in exchange for a defense pact and maybe some other goodies from the United States. I think, I mean, obviously the Biden administration is still entertaining that, so we'll have to see where that goes. That's going to be contingent upon a supposed, irreversible steps, according to Saudi officials' terms, towards a two-state solution with the Palestinians. How that's possible is an entirely other question. But I think it's fair to say that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, which have U.S. troop presence there, they would like to see greater commitment from the United States. They're within range of Iran's ballistic missiles. They're within range of, as we saw in 2019, with the attack on Abqaiq and Khurais, the Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia. They're well within range of the Iran-backed militias, drones, cruise missiles. This is a threat to their image, to their global standing. Saudi Arabia and the UAE both jockeying for greater role in the global economy, essentially. And they want this reputation of modernizing Arab states, and it's not going to go well for them if they keep having drones and missiles land on their territory. So the Biden administration is, obviously in negotiations, trying to get an end to the conflict with the Houthis. But yeah, we'll have to see where it goes. I'm sorry, the first part of your question is.
Sorry, I'm muted. It was noteworthy that short of Bahrain, no other Arab partners in the region joined on to the maritime task force assembled by the Biden administration. Why was that?
That's a really good question. So the first thing to note is that we don't know that they didn't. They simply didn't announce it. And there are real sensitivities in not only the Gulf, but in Arab states across the board, domestically with this US-backed Israeli war in Gaza, which has brought unbelievable devastation to the Gaza Strip. And, Arab populations are aware of the history of, the treatment of the Palestinians, and they have a different perception of it than I think a lot of Americans and a lot of folks in the West. So that puts serious pressure, or could put serious pressure on countries like Jordan, Egypt, from their domestic populations, Saudi Arabia as well. I mean, if you look at some of the opinion polls, so to the extent that they can be, taken at face value. But I think you'll notice as well, I think during some of the strikes on the Houthis, that the US and UK launched, and then some of the subsequent follow-up strikes by the United States, it wasn't mentioned in the Pentagon and the CENTCOM readouts what sort of strikes they were, whether they were air or naval. It just said strikes, which is unusual for the Defense Department to be that secretive about it. That's likely because some of these strikes were launched by American fighter jets and strike jets launched out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. When I was in Qatar with the Defense Secretary at the end of December, U.S. Secretary Lloyd Austin, Defense Pentagon Chief, they were setting up a press briefing at Udeid with the Qatari Defense Chief. Side by side, the podiums were being set up. And at the very last minute before the cameras began rolling, a team of assistants rolled in and pulled the Qatari Defense Chief's podium. And Secretary Austin spoke in front of the cameras alone. He was totally surprised by this, played it off well, but he read from his speech in which he was clear that he wasn't aware that he was going to be giving this address alone. So, I mean, there are real sensitivities in the Gulf for Gulf leaders to be associated with the U.S. military activity in the region, while the bombs that are raining down on Gaza and leveling whole neighborhoods in Gaza are being made in the U.S.
I'm going to jump around a little bit because I just want to make sure we get to all of our audience questions. rewinding to last Sunday's attack in Jordan, unlike Iraq and Syria, Jordan is not home to bases for Iranian-backed militias. So how did this attack on U.S. troops get through? And what can you tell us about the military installation that was hit, known as Tower 22?
That's a great question. So Tower 22 is a support base for the Al Tanf garrison. These are obscure, I mean, in the American public mind, and these are forgotten vestigial base infrastructure from the Defeat ISIS campaign. If you go way back to 2014, 15, 16, recall that the war against ISIS, the U.S. campaign against ISIS was, a special operations led campaign, special forces, particularly Army Special Forces. So the approach was to establish a base. One of the tasks for the U.S. Army was to establish a base on the tri-border intersection between Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. That also happens to be where the Baghdad-Damascus highway lies. And that was supposed to be a position. It used to be occupied by ISIS. I think it was taken by U.S. Special Operations, captured in 2015 or so. And they set up a base there, and the task they had was to basically raise Syrian rebel militia. And this was separate from the CIA mission, which was the counter-Assad mission. And the military was supposed to raise Syrian fighters to fight ISIS, to push into Deir ez-Zor, the ISIS heartland, the sort of not so much the breadbasket, but the oil producing heartland, which at the time Pentagon planners believed created most of the revenue for ISIS. That never succeeded, and what in fact happened is in 2017 the U.S. backed Kurdish-led forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, led by the YPG Syrian offshoot of the or cousin of the Turkish PKK. They ended up taking Syria's oil fields instead. So what you have in Syria is you have this sort of stillborn strategy, which was built by the Trump administration, the late Trump administration in 2017, off of the remnants of a sort of how the battlefield just fell during the campaign against ISIS. Tower 22, the Al Tanf garrison, the bases along the Euphrates, Conoco, Green Village, and the one at Al Omar oil field. These are sort of remnants of the U.S. campaign against ISIS, which is no longer, it's in name, it's active, but U.S. forces aren't going on, major ground clearing raids every single day. As to how this drone attack happened, that's been under investigation by U.S. CENTCOM. Pentagon officials are very reluctant to discuss any details. We saw early reports, first in the Wall Street Journal, that the drone may have been coming in right behind a U.S. Unmanned drone, and it might have confused the air defense systems, or perhaps U.S. Ground controllers turned off the air defense systems to allow their own drone in, and it accidentally let the other drone in. I've also heard that the drone came in at an unusually low altitude, that these militias have been experimenting with altitude, angle, and trajectory. Different air defense systems are good for different trajectories. You have the U.S. has the CRAM system in Baghdad, for example, which is really good at high trajectory sort of rockets and mortars. The Iron Dome, the Israeli Iron Dome has a very specific, focus on trajectory. So it's possible these militias are experimenting. I think it's actually very likely. But U.S. officials are reluctant to talk about it because, quite frankly, their forces left over from the de-ISIS campaign are vulnerable.
Jared, if it's okay if we go a few minutes over, I think we've got one or two remaining questions. One of our attendees asks, assuming the administration gets its response right and there is no further major escalation, how will the episode play in the longer term in U.S. politics? Are Republicans pushing for a major attack on Iran, or will the U.S. casualties prompt, for example, Donald Trump to argue for some kind of U.S. troop withdrawal from the region?
Yeah, that's tough to say. Politics isn't quite my forte. It might be a better question for both of us. But I think it's inevitable if Donald Trump were to be the nominee and potentially the president again, that he would want to withdraw of U.S. forces from Syria. He tried to do it twice. One time he almost succeeded. The commander-in-chief's word is that those are the orders. But the U.S. footprint in Syria is it's occupying a very valuable geographic space, which would, if there were a withdrawal, it would, cause quite a lot of chaos and cause the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces really to be carved up by their neighbors. So we'll have to see how that plays out politically. I would be surprised if the Biden administration gets a one-off and the militias don't respond. That also may depend on the talks that the talks that the Biden administration is pushing with Egypt and Qatar to bring about a pause in the fighting in exchange for hostages. If they can get the Israeli government and Hamas to agree, that if that could coincide with the strikes, which I think is likely what another reason for one of the delay you're seeing in the U.S. action. If they can get those two to coincide, you might be able to get the guns to go quiet right at the right time. How that'll play out politically, yeah, I mean, if you want to say anything, Elizabeth.
No, I think we saw the sort of expected response from names like Lindsey Graham and who else? Tom Cotton and Roger Wicker this week, demanding not only a forceful response, but strikes inside Iran. And yeah, I agree. We'll just have to wait and see. Are we getting one more? Oh, we got one more. I'm going to give you, Jared. Is there thinking in the Pentagon about how to address the long-term security challenge posed to the region by non-state actors with national-style military means, trained, equipped, and funded by Iran? How should the U.S. address this strategically?
That is, if we've been talking about $10 million questions, that's the billion-dollar question. The United States has not come up with a coherent and successful strategy for this in recent years. You saw during the Trump administration, there was a push by some in the Pentagon to match the sort of gray zone non-state actor provocations that Iran was fomenting with the US's own sort of covert action. To the extent that that continues is totally unclear. But I think what is clear is that sending aircraft carriers and B-52 flyovers over the southern Iranian coast every time a rocket lands near the embassy in Baghdad hasn't been a long-term solution, and it's been a real tax on the joint force. How Pentagon planners square that circle and how the NSC squares that circle will remain to be seen. There are experts in warfare that would know this better than I. So I hesitate to make any recommendations. I think it's clear that the Biden administration needs an approach and needs it quite quickly. To get back to the previous question, I think it's relevant for this one as well. The previous administration, there was quite a lot of talk inside the White House about potentially doing a strike on Iran. If you recall that President Trump had called off a strike that was supposed to, retaliate for the downing of a U.S. Unmanned drone, called off the strike while the aircraft were in the air. The Biden administration came in with an entirely different approach. I mean, they really sought to sideline the folks that were pushing for an aggressive response directly on Iranian territory. I mean, during the Trump administration, there was a push by the White House when John Bolton was national security advisor. There was an attempt to get from CENTCOM strike plans to strike Iran proper. And there was real reluctance in the Pentagon to go along with this because of fear that the commander-in-chief may not fully understand the consequences of doing that at a time when U.S. troops, are, I don't want to say surrounded, but sharing a geographic space with quite a lot of non-state actors. So that was a real point of contention within the Pentagon during the late Trump administration. The Biden administration does have plans, if they wanted to, that were drawn up by CENTCOM and sent up by the Pentagon to strike Iranian territory in the event of a sort of major contingency in which U.S. troops, significant number of U.S. troops are killed at a base, similar to the incident we saw at Tower 22. They do have those plans. I think the Biden administration has shown extraordinary restraint. Now, what a strike on Iran would look like is another question. I think this sort of planning is often designed by CENTCOM and Joint Staff Planners, they're designed to send a signal without necessarily starting a war. So, maybe hitting unoccupied, unused training facilities on the Iranian coast in the middle of the night when no one's there. That would be the first volley. Then another volley would be something like, say, if the Iranians respond with 10 ballistic missiles launched at, Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, then the U.S. would have to respond again, and minimal escalation, but still sending a signal with hopefully avoiding casualties to the extent that is possible, and going from there. But I don't think this administration has any appetite for going down that road.
Finally, Jared, I'd like to bring this back to the war in Gaza. The Biden administration has said repeatedly that it doesn't want to see a regional conflict. But in the militias, and in particular, the Houthis say that their attacks will continue as long as Israel's war in Gaza goes on. So I think a question, many have is, why not just use U.S. leverage to stop the war in Gaza instead of escalating with the militias?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think the Biden administration, or particularly the president himself, has decided that Israel is going to see this through with their campaign in Gaza. And there is obviously a diplomatic effort to not only to de-escalate on the on Israel's northern front with Hezbollah, but also to get these hostage release in exchange for a pause in the fighting. So it seems very clear the Biden administration is actually pushing for at least a prolonged pause in the fighting, which I'm sure administration officials would be relieved if it did wind up concluding this conflict. It's caused quite a lot of backlash domestically. It's causing political problems for Biden. We saw with this trip to Michigan yesterday. This administration, I think, has also made clear they're not going to simply call up the Israeli government. The president isn't going to call Netanyahu and tell him to pull the plug. That's not going to happen anytime soon. So Biden, the president, has boxed himself into a very tricky position. And U.S. troops are, we now have 3 U.S. troops who are killed amid this, the wider conflagration over this. Now, the other side of this too is that the United States doesn't abide by ultimatums by non-state actors, right? So, these factions in Iraq and Syria, backed by the IRGC. IRGC is considered a terrorist organization, the Quds Force. So the Biden administration isn't about to say, "Oh, you'll stop the shooting." Okay, well, you know what? We'll just throw our ally Israel under the bus and tell them they have to call off, the longest war in their history because, we're under the gun there in Iraq and Syria. I don't think that's the approach this administration is going to take. Certainly not this Pentagon. The U.S. has a significant amount of firepower in the region, and they're to the extent they're willing to use it and how they're willing to use it, we're going to find out. But yeah.
Jared, thanks for making such great points. Unfortunately, I'm afraid we're about out of time. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining. And of course, thank you for submitting your questions. Keep an eye out for more of Jared's excellent reporting from the Pentagon, and be sure to stay tuned for our next webinar in this series. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.